Okay, rolling through the bills here. I think we voted on all of the sections of this technical and administrative changes bill. Weeks and weeks and weeks ago, so would love for you to take us through it a final time, Abby.
Sure. So it's for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. I think you have seen or discussed every section of this bill, as you mentioned. I'm not sure that you have seen one of the sections relating to the land use change tax, but I know you have discussed it. So under my name, and I just realized, are you sharing on this? Do you want me to share on this?
Oh, sure, that'd be great.
I didn't log into the Zoom, so. No, yes, and I need that. Yes, please. But you have discussed or seen all of this language. So everything with the exception of that land use change tax section was proposed by the administration and the tax department. So you have also heard from them. And there is both a section by section summary as well as actual language. I think it was over a month ago that you last saw any versions of those. So I will just jump on the Zoom. I'm sorry, I could have done that earlier.
Okay.
To get back into the habit of screen sharing. Would you prefer to see the language or the section by section?
I think because we're gonna vote, the language would be good.
Great. Thank you, Saoirse. Very fast.
Just letting you in.
Okay. Oh.
Committee then.
Maybe.
Just trying to make it bigger. Great.
You make it a little larger.
Sure.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so the first two sections, so to start, I may refer to this as a miscellaneous tax bill, just as that's sort of the convention. The title is an act relating to technical and administrative changes to Vermont's tax laws. Technical and administrative, there are some policy issues. We have a separate bill that Legislative Council compiles that's a purely technical bill. So these are actually policy issues, but they're more technical and administrative in nature. The first two are the annual link to federal statute. So this is typically in this bill or in the budget bill. And this lines up both income tax and the estate tax. The first section is income tax. I'll scroll down. The second section is for estate tax. And when I say income tax, that does apply to both corporate and personal. So it pulls in all of federal definitions and federal statute and applies all of those definitions to, unless otherwise not withstood, to Vermont tax laws through the end of last year. And then in the effective date section, it says that only applies for taxable year 22 and going forward. And this was debated at length during the COVID years because of the retroactive changes that were made federally. There have not been there's been nothing that sort of unusual that's happened in the last year. So there's nothing to really highlight or alarm bells going off here. This is a little more typical. Okay, the next section, section 3 does actually interact with section 4 as well. And it's clarifying the taxation of alcoholic beverages with the changes that have allowed alcoholic beverages to be sold for takeout for consumption off premises. So it clarifies that the current sales tax exemption for the sale of alcoholic beverages only applies to those that are taxed or exempt under meals and rooms tax. That's the current exemption. And then adds in that when alcoholic beverages are sold for consumption off premises by a licensed restaurant or manufacturer, that actually is subject to sales tax. I'm gonna slowly scroll down so you'll see it has that cross-reference on line 18. You'll see that language here. This is now in section 4, it's the meals and rooms and alcoholic beverages tax chapter. And within those definitions, you have all of the exclusions from a taxable meal. And that's what's being cross-referenced, saying sales tax does apply when alcoholic beverages produced or manufactured by a licensed restaurant or operator are sold for consumption off premises. Those are the containers being sold for consumption not on a restaurant's premises. So it's the primary change. Sure, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
So does that mean that just means the meals and rooms tax isn't
Isn't applied.
to that? So if I go get a meal with alcohol in the restaurant, that's,
That
Rooms
is
and meals.
taxable. Yep.
and then get one to go, then that's just sales tax.
Then that's sales tax, exactly. Unless it's all
Just sales tax.
just on the alcohol portion, if it's separated out from the rest of the meals tax charge.
So
I'm
that
assuming those
happens.
are two different transactions. I don't know if you,
Say it's
I don't-
one. Yeah,
does that happen? I don't know.
I've done it.
You'll pay more.
Yes, it should, if it's itemized, it should be subject to sales tax if you're taking it to go.
Okay.
That's my understanding how that would work. With bundled transactions, if they're not itemized, it's all subject to, would be all subject to meals tax, but if you're itemizing, then you can separate which tax applies. The general rule here is clarifying if it's a to-go beverage, it would be subject to sales tax. If you're sitting and consuming the alcohol on premises, it's meals or alcoholic beverages tax.
So if I were to do it in the future, I should do two separate transactions
be sure.
to be
It's not, it doesn't, I mean, most transactions are itemized.
To be honest, I'll look at it, so when I go to the restaurant. But it's good, I will not. Okay.
That's the primary change, the most significant. There's really a technical change to line up the alcoholic beverages definition. So right now it lists malt beverages, vinous beverages, spirits, fortified wines. That's alcoholic beverages is otherwise defined in Title VII. And it's just making it clear that any changes to the Title VII definition will flow through. So we're not having a different tax treatment when you're also looking at licenses and enforcement at the liquor and lottery level. So it's, this is quite technical across titles of statute. And then 11B again repeats that alcoholic beverages are exempt from the meals and rooms tax and alcoholic beverages tax when they're for off premises consumption. Okay, moving on to section 5. There are two sections that deal with refunds, primarily in meals and rooms tax, but also local option tax, both for sales and use and meals and rooms tax. So the first change here is in the meals and rooms tax statute. This was the recommendation from the department. The first changes here are to remove gendered language in line 14, and the primary change relating to refunds starts on page 5. So this aligns with the sales and use tax treatment for refunds. Under sales and use tax, if an operator or a vendor is requesting a refund, they have to show that the purchaser has actually been refunded because the tax falls on the purchaser. The department realized this wasn't as clear in the meals and rooms tax chapter, so they proposed language to add that in to make it clear that an operator can't request a refund unless the purchaser has been already refunded, or the operator can show that they made the overpayment, so it was their error. And then it also allows a purchaser to seek a refund because that language wasn't in, or is not currently in statute. And then the next change is something that has been discussed, and I think you had a robust discussion with the department about the current status of local option tax towns, especially where there are towns that share a zip code or previously shared a zip code. In the case of Essex and Essex Junction, what to do when there are sales. So often what's happening with online sales is there is a vendor that has a software that collects on behalf of the vendor, and they're not necessarily getting the really granular data about which town the individual receiving, so the purchaser is actually making, paying for a sale that's taxable or not taxable. if, depending on whether that town has actually imposed a local option tax.
I remember Rebecca Samroth getting really excited about zip codes with us.
Just some great
Yeah.
graphics and lots of colors. And it gets very complicated very quickly. And it's not as simple as just saying, look at the zip code or the 9-digit zip code, that it gets messier. So their proposal to deal with those refunds were first to either try to refund directly to the purchaser if possible. And then there's this catch-all of what to do where the purchaser cannot reasonably be determined if there has been a local option tax collected in a municipality that doesn't actually have a local option tax. So the default, if a purchaser can't be refunded, is to have the department send those erroneously collected tax revenues in the same way that sales tax or meals and rooms tax would be allocated. So here it lists out the different funds. It's either the education fund for sales tax, or it's split between the ed fund, the general fund, and the clean water fund for meals and rooms tax. For the next couple of sections, it deals with the CAP-TAP, both fees and the whole program itself. It's the Computer Assisted Property Tax Administration Program. Based on the department's testimony, this program is not in operation currently. So both the program authority and the authority to charge fees is being repealed in section 7 down and in section 8. It also required in section 8 for towns to send brand list copies to the director of PVR, who then had to maintain copies at the office for 2 years. So these are sort of conforming changes. If the program's being repealed, this should also be repealed from the statute. So the next changes are to current use and notifications that the director has to provide for the different communications during the current use qualification and continuing certification process. So the proposal from the department was to strike any reference to sending notices by mail. So there are several notices throughout this section, and there are also some fixes to gendered language. So it starts with subsection C on line 15, that the director shall notify the applicant not later than April 15th of the director's decision. So this is when an applicant is trying to get into the program and no longer would require delivery by mail to the applicant's last and usual place of abode. And you'll see that same language is being struck. So that's for application for the program, which means the director will be able to notify by email or by another form of notification. That was subsection C. Now going into the annual certification, at least for agricultural use, but any determination that an enrollee, someone who's currently in the program, is no longer eligible, no longer would require notification by mail. It's the same change. And then it's also no longer requiring the director to mail a list of current use properties to each municipality. So it just says the director shall provide. That gives more discretion.
I'm sorry, I know you're not from tax savvy, but do you remember the reason for these changes? I'm just can't remember what.
My understanding is just that it's more discretion given for, I don't know if they had provided, and I could go back to look at their testimony, or they could come back in if you wanted to, but I'm assuming it's so they don't have to spend money on the mailings.
But I remember it
Yes,
was
but-
actually it was drawing out conversations longer than they needed to be drawn out, because we couldn't engage in like just sort of a back and forth conversation with some folks, because they had to send a letter each time rather than like once the letter was sent, engage in an email or a phone
Okay.
call
Yeah.
in order to get it resolved, because they were sort of waiting on each mailing in order to
That
take
sounds,
the
yeah,
next
that
step.
sounds, okay, thank you. I know that, I get an annual letter from the department just asking me if I've done any firewood cutting and that sort of thing. But this is different stuff. Okay, thank you.
There's also some just standard drafting changes that are in there as well, the on or before, and then some instead of by, and then some gender language changes. And again, if there's a removal from the program, so it's each step of the process of being enrolled, applying, being enrolled, and then staying certified, the director would have the ability to provide notice as opposed to mail. Okay, so page 11 with section 10. This is still within the heading of current use because this does relate to when the land use change tax would otherwise apply. And this is new language that you have discussed, but I don't believe the full committee has seen the proposed language. So section 10 would create a new exemption from the land use change tax, which applies when property is removed or developed from the current use program for land owned or acquired by a Native American tribe or a nonprofit organization that qualifies for the exemption from property tax. It was enacted last session under subdivision 3802 sub 21 of the same title, Title 32, which means if it's exempt from the land use change tax, it will be the owner will be able to request a release of the current use lien. So there's both the exemption from the tax and the ability to have the lien removed from the land. There are other types of properties that have exemptions from the land use change tax, including certain federal properties. And I could give you a list. It's all in the statute, which I haven't shown because that would be much more lengthy, but I can provide that if you'd like. And
Could you have something?
Is the 3802 the charitable and pious?
no, so thank you. I just realized I would have to jump out of screen sharing, but to remind everyone, the 380221 that was enacted last session did have very specific conditions for both tribes or nonprofits to qualify. So it is a state recognized tribe or a nonprofit that owns and operates the land for the purposes of the tribe.
Different than the pious?
Yes, totally
Thank
different.
you.
That is, I think, subdivision 2.
Yeah, once knew it.
I should know, it might be 4. I
Yeah.
don't quote me on that. So yeah, so there are guardrails there, but through that cross-reference, you're pulling in all of the conditions. So if a property qualifies for the property tax exemption, it can also be exempt from land use change tax, which is a 10% tax. Okay, great. And then everything else the committee has seen. So this was also a recommended change from the department in the property transfer tax. So at the time of sale, for controlling interests with nonprofits, transfers to organizations that qualify as nonprofits under 501c3 already have an existing exemption, as you'll see if they meet the public support test, and then have these other purposes here relating to farm use. And this new exemption would also exempt transfers between related organizations that are qualifying 501c3 nonprofits. A related organization means one organization holds 50% or more of the membership interest of the other organization, or one organization has control over the other. So it's listed there, appoints or elects, including the power to remove and replace 50% or more of the members of the organization's governing body. So to related organizations, transfers will be exempt both from property transfer tax and the clean water surcharge. And then this, starting on line 13, there is a limit to the exemption, which states that if within 5 years after the date of the first transfer, the related organizations then resell, both the second and the first transfer will be subject to property transfer tax and the clean water surcharge. It also requires the tax that would be imposed on both of those transfers to be paid not later than 30 days after the second transfer. Okay.
Is that, Abby, is that if they transfer it to the other third 501c3 or to a private party?
So it subsequently transfers any portion of the property. So it would need to be to a non-related organization or else the first exemption wouldn't apply. So it would be to a non-related.
Okay.
So I would read that as allowing, if there's a third organization that's also related, I'm not sure how that would, no, I don't think that would work mathematically because you'd have to have 50% or more. So I think it would have to it'd be a third party. Okay, the next change is to the the child independent care credit. And this is changing there are two changes here that are notable. So the first, the committee had heard that there was a limit. So I'll take a step back. So last session, there were many changes to both the child tax credit and then the child independent care credit. There were previously two care credits that were combined into this one credit, which anyone is eligible for. There's no longer the Vermont specific income threshold. The amount of the credit was also increased, so it's now 72% of the federal credit. However, there were some provision of care requirements that were removed. However, care was still required to be provided in Vermont. So this language now strikes that requirement that the care be provided in this state. Secondly, it has this new language you'll see starting on line 9 that prorates the amount of the credit based on what was enacted in the child tax credit, and what that was further based on what's in the earned income tax credit in Vermont. So the amount of the credit is prorated based on the individual's Vermont income that they've earned while they are a resident of Vermont compared to their total income. So if they have income they're receiving from other states that's not, or if they were a resident of another state during part of the year, so perhaps they have $100,000 of income, but maybe only $50,000 while they were a Vermont resident, their credit will be reduced accordingly. That is, again, has been in statute for the earned income tax credit and was enacted into the child tax credit. So this lines those up. And that, again, was a request of the department. Okay. If there aren't any other questions on that, I'll move on to another request. So I've been saying these were all administration's requests. I apologize, this one section was not. I understand it came from Vermont Housing Finance Agency. So this is extending the VHFA's ability to issue exemption certificates for certain qualified rental units. And I will scroll down to the next page. It is a small change in terms of the language. The way this exemption, I won't get into the math of it, but the exemption in the brief version is that a certain portion of certain rent restricted properties, a certain portion of that property value is reduced, and VHFA certifies that the properties qualify to get this exemption. However, when this was enacted in the statute, it was limited so that VHFA could only renew that certificate of exemption once. This language allows VHFA to continue every 10 years to renew the exemption and the certificate of exemption, and there's no limit to how many times VHFA could renew that certificate. The next two sections relate to the homestead property tax credit. One relates to notices that are going to homestead owners that are sent by the town. And the other is a sort of joint request from the taxpayer advocate and I believe it was legal aid also came in and spoke to you about this. So the first section, section 14, amends existing statute. Currently, the Commissioner of Taxes already has to provide towns a notice describing the homestead property tax credit. This adds in more specificity, saying it needs to be in plain language. It needs to include the eligibility requirements and the deadlines for claiming a property tax credit. It also, while it does allow, starting on line 12, going through line 16, it does allow towns the discretion to distribute the notice in alternative manners. So by email or front porch forum or any sort of information that the town wants to use to get more information to homestead taxpayers so that they can claim the credit. It does take away the ability in subsection C. It strikes allowing towns to use envelopes or mailers if they have envelopes or mailers for property tax bills that are too small to fit the notices, it takes away the ability of towns to say they can't send notices. So it does put a bit more of a burden on towns to make sure that they are sending notices to homestead property taxpayers. And to be clear, it only goes to taxpayers who own a homestead in that town. It wouldn't go to any property taxpayer. Section 15 is about amending the deadlines. So for a homestead property tax credit claim, currently the deadline is, there are several deadlines. First, the requirement is to file at the time of filing the personal income tax return. That's when folks fill out their homestead declaration and their household income form. However, there's this very hard stop on October 15th, after which homestead owners cannot claim the property tax credit under current law. So this extends that and makes it a softer, sort of longer deadline. So property taxpayers who have a homestead could claim they should be filing on April 15th. They'll get a $15 penalty for the town reissuing if they file after April 15th. But now homestead property taxpayers have until March 15th, so almost a full year after the original deadline to claim a property tax credit. But if they file between October 15th and March 15th, there is this $150 penalty. The credit will be issued directly to the claimant and there will be no impact on the property tax bill, so that the towns don't have to reissue a property tax bill if the homestead owner is filing late. There's still a hard deadline. It's just extended by 6 months. Sorry, 6 months. And then that is, that's the end of the substantive sections. Section 16 is the effective date section. This is probably the shortest miscellaneous tax bill effective date section I've ever seen. It's most of the provisions take effect on passage. You have the annual link, which says it takes effect on January 1st of 2023, but it applies to tax year 22. So it has that sort of funky retroactive date. And then because the child independent care credit is an income tax credit, it needs to start at the beginning of the taxable year. So that's also retroactive. It would apply starting January 1st of this year. So when taxpayers claim the credit next filing season in 2024, that's when it would first impact them. And then that is the miscellaneous tax bill this year, or technical and administrative changes bill.
Thank you.
Welcome. I'd be happy to provide any more information. I didn't catch many other questions. You're all familiar with it? Okay.
On a motion on this, will we pass this out as we received it here? Have we reviewed how we would wish to word it?
I will second that motion.
Great. Representative Maslin moved our committee bill and Representative Sims seconded. What?
This tax,
Yeah, we're calling it administrative and technical changes. Yes.
Draft 2.3.
Thank you. Draft 2.3. Any discussion? Then if the clerk could please call the roll. Thank you.
Andrews, yes. Anthony,
Yep.
Beck,
yes.
Brannigan,
Yes.
Demro,
Yes.
Maslin.
Yep.
Matos,
Yes.
Bodie,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Taylor,
Yes.
Canfield,
Yes.
Kornheiser.
Yes.
12-0-0.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
We're just getting stuff.
We're like really getting stuff done.
Should that be our tagline, the most efficient and effective committee?
You can't trust committees with taglines.
Okay.
Thank you, Abby. I think with that, we're gonna stop for the day. I think everyone has projects and floor reports and things that they're working on right now. So tomorrow, we're going to talk with Abby and Jill about the property valuation modernization bill that we were sort of picking to death. And I paused us in our picking and asked tax to come back with what they thought would be a good bill. And so they've basically done that and Abby's almost done with it. And so we'll talk about it tomorrow.
Super.
Yeah. I'm pretty pleased with sort of the way we found our way through it, I think. And then more bottle bill tomorrow and more school food tomorrow. And I'll see y'all then. Thanks.
Okay.
No team, don't yet.
I'm just gonna.
And Saoirse's not here.
Okay.
Can you email